I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome this evening to the Pre-Raphaelite landscape. This talk tonight really connects with a number of talks I've done over the past 3 to 4 years. It's a particular interest of mine, and many of the photographs that are original photographs taken in galleries and from private collections in the UK. It's a look at a particular type of landscape and a very significant movement in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. So without further ado, I shall begin with my first slide. And this starts back in the 18th century with this gentleman here, Sir Joshua Reynolds, who established the Royal Academy of Art in London. He had laudable aims to elevate the status of British painting, and indeed it was very successful in that way. And there's seldom a stately home or palace in Britain that doesn't include a number of portraits by Sir Joshua Reynolds. What is of importance is that he looked at art in a very particular way, and he in his discourses, which were delivered to students of the First Royal Academy, he elevated a certain hierarchy of painting, and among the top rank was historical painting, that is mythological or biblical historical subjects. Second to that was portrait painting, that was to be mindful of the great portraits of the past, particularly the great portraits of the Renaissance. And in a lower rank was genre painting of domestic scenes and incident. Much lower down was landscape, and still lower was animal painting and still life. But landscape was seen as a secondary form of art, really. And although there were notable exceptions in the 18th century, like Richard Wilson, there weren't many artists who, Gainsborough did landscape, but he did them as a sort of sideline. They weren't his main bread and butter work. But our talk tonight really begins with a meeting that took place in September of 1848 with these 7 young men. And it took place in Gower Street in Bloomsbury, just behind the British Museum. And these young men had been meeting in one form or another for over a year as part of a drawing club, a psychographic club, where they had exchanged drawings and thoughts about art. They were, some of them, members of the drawing schools of the Royal Academy, and indeed the most notable of all the students who met there was John Everett Millais, who had been admitted to the Royal Academy schools at the age of 12. So he was already a very accomplished artist at the age of 18. He met with Rossetti, of course, the great Italian son of the great Italian poet and emigre, and his brother William Michael Rossetti, and another young man who was also training at the Royal Academy schools was William Holman Hunt. And it was Hunt and Millais who are really going to be the stars of our show tonight. They really developed their ideas, and certainly the forceful character of William Holman Hunt plays an enormous part in the development of this new type of landscape. And this is largely to do with Hunt's reading of John Ruskin's Modern Painters, and the first 4 volumes of which were highly influential upon this young group of painters who sought in their work to bring about some sort of change from some of the stuffiness of the Academy, and certainly some of the paintings that they considered of a lower rank that they had witnessed at the Royal Academy summer exhibitions each year. In a quote which is often cited, particularly by Holman Hunt in his Pre-Raphaelitism and the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which he wrote at the end of his life, really summing up on how these young artists got together and how Pre-Raphaelite art developed. He cites this particular quote from John Ruskin, and it seems to encapsulate their attitude towards painting of landscape and nature, and it is his famous quote: "Go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth." Certainly, Ruskin had emphasized in his great championing of Turner and other modern artists that the artists that were the strongest artists of his period were those that actually did not paint just studio paintings of nature, but actually studied nature and drew from nature, and let nature speak and communicate through their study, and the study of botany was important, and looking at rocks, and if one could draw one single stone, one could draw a mountain. This is paramount in Ruskin's work. We can see in this early work of Jean-Évric Millet, painted about a year after the formation of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is not actually a landscape as such, but it includes very much this new idea of approaching nature with this almost microscopic detail, which was entirely new in Victorian art. And certainly Millet's own painting had undergone a tremendous transformation in the 10 months of the Brotherhood. And he now was working out of doors in full sunlight and painting directly from nature. It is said that he painted only the size of a florin every day into a wet white background with tiny little sable brushes, watercolor brushes. And he creates this scene from Tempest, and this is Ferdinand lured by Ariel, painted not far from here in Oxford, actually. But the young men who form the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the 7 young men, this is their stated aims, and it had tensions even from the start, because Rossetti was not the least bit interested in sitting outside and painting every leaf of a tree or every blade of grass on the ground in front of him. Indeed, he plays no part really in tonight's talk. For my talk tonight, I would cite 3 particular books, which are excellent books. If you can get a hold of them, I really do suggest that they give a good context to what I'm talking about tonight. One was a show that was put on by the Tate Gallery, I think probably about 14 or 15 years ago now, the Pre-Raphaelite Vision, Truth to Nature. And that really concentrates on this new attitude to painting and looking at nature and painting in a Pre-Raphaelite style. Perhaps the greatest book on it is by Professor Alan Staley of the Yale book, The Pre-Raphaelite Landscape. And this is a real thorough examination of what we mean by Pre-Raphaelite landscape and the many themes that were tackled by these young artists and their followers. And another exhibition that was held at the Tate a few years ago is the Pre-Raphaelites and Science. Again, a fascinating exhibition, because we will see in some of the paintings tonight that there is certainly this new Victorian attitude towards science and analysis of the world in which they live, and the questions which arise from a scientific viewpoint of the world, rather than previously held ideas about nature. So Victorian landscape painting in the 1840s and even into the 1850s, in the time of the Pre-Raphaelites, was seen again in the sort of terms of Reynolds as a sort of subsidiary art. There were some fine landscape painters. I particularly would cite John Linnell, who was a friend of the group called the Ancients, particularly a friend of an early supporter of William Blake and Samuel Palmer. And indeed, Samuel Palmer could be mentioned. He produced some very highly original imaginary and visionary landscapes in the early part of the 19th century. Certainly, Edwin Landseer's landscape sketches are worth note. They were painted direct from nature, but they're hardly Pre-Raphaelite in style. They are quite generalized and often do not have the rich palette that some of the Pre-Raphaelite painters exhibit. However, they do show a freshness about them, and I would recommend them. As I've been around various places, I've photographed Landseer's landscapes, and in fact, a couple of them, you know, he himself shows by his variation in later style in colour, that he might have been influenced to some extent by some of the richness of particularly Holman Hunt's colour. Now, John Ruskin, who is really behind so much of the intellectual heft of the Pre-Raphaelites, had already started collecting, with his father, collecting landscape paintings. Of particular note were the watercolours of Europe by Samuel Prout. And that's a good example there, a view of Nuremberg, the pane on the left. And Ruskin, as a young man in his teens and in his 20s, often made copies after Samuel Prout. And he was somebody who certainly did not get the withering criticism that Ruskin was so liberally passing around in the Royal Academy at this time. He liked Prout's approach to architecture and to light and painting some of these places around Europe. Indeed, it's on the Grand Tour, which Ruskin himself spent time in Switzerland and in Italy as well. So he had a very educated eye as a result of these travels. And Ruskin himself was no slouch when it came to drawing himself. And that's a good example of, in 1845, of a Ruskin monochrome study. And as you can see, Ruskin is a very fine draftsman, and he remained so because he believed that to study nature was to study the hand of God. And therefore, it was important that every artist should indeed go to nature with this singleness of heart and copy from nature and learn and let nature teach and don't overlook anything, and don't assume you can see things that that in it just through imagination. You must almost put that aside and let the trees or the sky or the stones or the cliffs speak to you. And many of these ideas are, of course, covered in Ruskin's magnum opus, really, the first volumes of Modern Painters, written between 1843 and 1860. So it really covers the emergence of Pre-Raphaelite art. But of course, Ruskin's other great love was the wonderful painter J.M.W. Turner, and he was very right in his championing of Turner's work. And in times, he tried to reconcile both the breadth of Turner and the myopic style of the Pre-Raphaelites. But he seems to have been correct in his estimation of the artists of the 1850s, and his word was almost taken as gospel during the 1850s in any of his criticisms at the Royal Academy. He could make or break an artist, and it was his defence of the Pre-Raphaelites following the criticisms that they had received in the 1850 exhibition that brought about this great change, this great sea change in British art. And those are the main themes that if we were to distill the main themes of modern painters, we could say that those subjects in the green pane there are what Ruskin was talking about in Modern Painters. And really, Ruskin is the first critic of our period, really, to analyze what paintings are about and why we respond to them. And of course, for him, it is the moral value of art that was so important, that a painting had to go well beyond just mere facsimile. It had to really engage with nature and then to express worthy ideas, just as the Pre-Raphaelites had discussed in Gower Street, that painting must not be debased in any way. Ruskin was very, very firmly against a lot of Dutch 17th century art because he saw it as celebrating low life and tavern scenes and that sort of thing. And he felt that art should be about much higher subjects that touch the very soul of mankind. One of Ruskin's quotes that Pre-Raphaelites pick up upon is, "If you can paint one leaf, you can paint the world." And Ruskin, this is the attitude, really, this Ruskin's attitude was how the Pre-Raphaelite painters approach nature, because you notice they approach it piecemeal. If you look at this painting on the right here, May in Regent's Park, 1851, you can see that the artist, Charles Alston Collins, a great friend of John Everett Millais, approaches landscape in an entirely different way to Turner. Indeed, he paints every leaf on those May bushes. He doesn't pay as great concern to the sort of grand compositions that were so favoured by Reynolds, the pyramid type structure of the composition. That doesn't play a part in Collins' work. It's all about looking at the particular and then from the particular branching out to produce a whole landscape. So it's a very typical early Pre-Raphaelite landscape painted from a window just overlooking Regent's Park. And it's an unusual composition. Collins didn't do very many landscapes, but that one is a very good example of this period. And this is another great quote from Ruskin: "All great art is the expression of man's delight in God's work, not his own." And this was Ruskin's dictum throughout his life, and it caused him to be attracted particularly to artists like Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais, who seemed to follow his programme. Ruskin was also generous towards Rossetti because he saw in him a sort of medieval approach to imagination and invention within his paintings. But in 1848, things had started out quite quietly. On weekends, Millais and Hunt would go to Hampstead and they would paint out of doors. And this is a rather conventional landscape by Millais before the formation of Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, probably in the early summer of 1848. And as you can see, it almost mirrors a Cuyp painting of bucolic scene, just lovely, just cows in just outside of a farmyard. It shows some of Millais' fascination with detail, and it's only a small. It's only probably a matter of 9 or 10 inches wide, so it's a small landscape, and it's painted out of doors quite obviously. But at this stage, it shows none of the remarkable qualities which were to emerge so soon after it. How do we categorize what is a Pre-Raphaelite landscape? Well, in the lower corner is an early Holman Hunt of a similar period at Ewell Church. And again, I've seen this painting. It was on exhibition at the Tate Gallery a few years ago. And certainly the surface is highly wrought. But again, it is still reasonably conventional. Hunt was still only just 20 years old when he painted that. But Pre-Raphaelite landscape, really following Ruskin's principles, employs microscopic detail. It tends to be much smaller scale than the grand landscapes of people like Wilson and even the Gainsborough landscapes. It features intense saturated colour, which is often in full sunlight. This was something that Reynolds spoke out against. He believed that painting should not be should not be lit by sunlight in quite that way, and certainly there should be the light source should be really in the painter's command rather than something that is naturally observed. Again, they weren't painted with bristle brushes or hogshair brushes largely, but with sable brushes on white porcelain palettes, and the paint was applied very thinly. There was no heavy impasto or overworking. They were painted piecemeal, as I've already pointed out, and they took close attention to botanical detail or accuracy. This is a good example later on, which of a little watercolor by John Ruskin of just a bit of a brick covered in moss. And you can see Ruskin applying those Pre-Raphaelite principles to such a humble subject as this. And this is a typical example. This is a teaching example by John Ruskin for the Guild of St. George. So really, a sea change happened with the formation of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The artists were working now out of doors, and these are two examples of Holman Hunt in 1849 during the first year of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And here he is painting a cornfield at Ewell, which is near where he painted some of his most famous early Pre-Raphaelite paintings, and the Haunted Manor, which is in the possession of the Tate Britain as well. And both show really a change in approach. not least because of the, if you notice, the blue shadows on the corn by the corn stooks. This is highly revolutionary. Certainly, few artists were using rich colours such as these for painting landscape at the time. Even Turner had not developed quite that degree of observation of optics, and indeed this is a good 20 years really before the Impressionists were painting using blue shadows and violets in the shadows. And Holman Hunt's haunted manor with this little stream tumbling over these rocks. One can see in this something that would point to a painting 5 years later by John Averitt Millais of the waterfall at Glenfinglas. But this is the first tour de force by Holman Hunt, really, in landscape terms. And this is a painting that is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford of the converted British family, hiding from the persecution of the Druids. In fact, it's not historically accurate, but it has it depicts this sort of shelter with this Christian priest in a Pieta pose. But what I want to talk about in this today is really its landscape portions, which are the background being painted out of the doors at Yule, and you can see the golden corn. You can see a rich blue sky, and you can see it's in bright summer sunlight, which is very unusual for paintings of this period, which often had murky, sort of Reynolds-like areas of scumble paint in the corners and dark chiaroscuro. This is not the fact with Hunt, and Hunter's painting in these colours which are Italianate and rich and jewel-like. And there's a little detail of the stream in front of this booth, this early Christian shelter, which is like an early church chancel, and in it, and you can see just at the water's edge, I've just taken a little detail from it, which I took in the Ashmolean. You can see the microscopic detail in which Hunt paints this particular painting. But all the botanical details are accurate, as is the vine which forms the roof of this booth, and the reeds on the right, and the fishing nets. Everything is painted as if observed by almost scientific in its illustrative power. And this other painting in the Ashmolean Museum by Charles Olson Collins, Convent Thoughts, is an excellent example of this very, very strong early Pre-Raphaelite landscape approach, painted in the garden at Walton Street of Thomas Coombs' house. This obviously depicts a nun in a closed order contemplating a passion flower. Passion flower, as you can see, I've done a photograph of a passion flower on the right. It points up the idea of the language of flowers, which is so important to the Victorians, that every flower had a meaning. And of course, we have various different types of lilies in this, which of course allude to the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. We have the nun holding the missal in her hand, pointing to a scene of crucifixion. But this is reinforced by her holding the passion flower, which the sepals and stamen indicate the nails in the hands of Christ on the cross. And we also have the water lilies and the idea of reflection, of course. So that's quite a straightforward symbolic allusion to the idea that she is leaving a life of contemplation and reflection. And it also echoes the canticles, my beloved is like a garden enclosed. Of course, paintings such as this got a lot of criticism, not necessarily for the way they were painted, but because of their Catholicism, which was still a very controversial to many of these sort of very strong Protestants of mid-Victorian England. So that's a parody of it from Punch up in the middle there. And of course, the language of flowers is a fundamental part of so much Pre-Raphaelite landscape painting. So you almost have to read the painting as well. Apart from it being true to nature, it also, every flower will have a symbol, and it's almost like an unlocking, a code that will unlock further meaning into the painting. And therefore the painting is much more than just a scene in sunlight or just of a nun. It says so much more. This is a detail from it. You see that just shows you the incredible detail of these paintings, and you can see how different these water lilies are to, say, an artist like Claude Monet in France 30 years later painting water lilies. This is the polar opposite to that. This is absolutely painted with such acute attention to detail that you can hardly believe it's almost by a human hand. It is such as its fastidious detail. And another painting of the early period of the Pre-Raphaelites, 1850 to 51, was painted here in Wytham Woods near Oxford. And this illustrates a poem by Coventry Patmore, The Woodman's Daughter. It's a tale of a class of the squire's son and the woodman's daughter who form a childhood friendship. But of course, in that there is a link with what happens later on, that she will bear the squire an illegitimate child who eventually, and there's eventually a drowning, and it's in a tragedy. And of course, this passing of the fruit to sort of is a reverse of the Garden of Eden. But at the background, I want you to notice, is painted with incredible detail. This is all painted out of doors, and believe me, to paint something like this in Britain out of doors is quite a challenge. I think you will notice too that Millet is also looking to the newly acquired painting by Uccello at the Ashmolean, or the Oxford University's collection, and you can see quite clearly that he bases the tunic of the young squire upon the horseman in Uccello's The Forest Hunt. And also Millet is very conscious of things like this. Albrecht Dürer's the great piece, this painting of the plants and the clod of earth, and you can see how Millet too, in his Woodman's Daughter, has also likewise approached nature in the same style. Just look at the way he has painted the grasses and all the plants on the ground at the feet there. Nothing is left to chance. And there is the scene as it is today in Wytham Woods, University of Oxford research woodland. You can get a pass to go in there, and I went with Dr. Nigel Fisher, and we located the spot where Millet most probably painted The Woman's Daughter. And as you can see, there we are. There's Lucas Cranach's painting of Adam and Eve, which of course it alludes to in some way. And the same with Holman Hunt, this great painting, The Howling Shepherd of 1851, also paint the background, all painted outside at Ewell, south of London, near the Hogsmill stream, near where Ophelia was painted. But Hunt too is a very canny artist. He's aware of a number of, he's an artist above all who wants to put forward a moral position within his work. The hireling shepherd, the biblical idea of a hireling shepherd. He alludes, of course, to earlier iterations of the paintings of shepherds and shepherdesses, particularly Françoise Boucher from the Wallace collection, the Manchester collection in Manchester Square. There we have a young shepherd and shepherdess piping to each other. He was probably aware of Miriam Mulready's Open Your Mouth and Shut Your Eyes from 1839. He would have known of that painting too. But what Hunt is alluding to is the state that the church is in, and obviously it's the Scarlet Woman, the whore of Babylon, who he is referring to in this particular painting. And you can see the half-eaten apples, symbolic of the fruit of the Garden of Eden, and the neglect of the flock in the background, which is, of course, the main purpose of this, that the hireling shepherd won't look after the sheep. And he is also being highly critical of the church, particularly in the 1850s, and saying that the priests are neglecting their flock. So there's all of that in Hunt's work in this particular painting, which is in Manchester City Art Gallery. And as a spin-off from that painting, he also painted this other one called Our English Coast, a smaller study just of sheep, but never with Hunt is it just about a landscape or sheep. Of course, he is talking about other things, about the strayed sheep. We see the sheep, the sheep caught in the thicket there, which would allude to that the binding of Isaac and the sheep, which was to be as a sacrifice and to set up the covenant between God and man on Mount Moriah. The painting itself was painted at Fairlight Down near Hastings, and it's again a highly accurate depiction of this. I've actually stood here and painted here myself, so I know this cliff quite well. But it also echoes a painting from 6 years before by Edwin Landseer called Peace, which is a much more conventional piece of Victorian painting. But I think you can see the relationship between the two quite clearly here. And of course, its title, Our English Coasts, also alludes to the fact that we shouldn't also neglect or to protect our coastline. Of course, there were still great memories of the Napoleonic Wars and suspicion of attack from Europe. And so that all plays a part in it, and also, as do the late afternoon shadows in there, the lengthening shadow. But it is a remarkable piece of painting, and it was commented upon by the great French artist Eugène Delacroix at the 1867 exhibition. British art was pretty insular, but some Pre-Raphaelite paintings were exhibited in some of the international exhibitions and were most appreciated by a number of French artists. But this, above all, is the painting which really is a tour de force. This is Millet's greatest painting, Ophelia, scene from Hamlet of Ophelia drowning as she sings. But what's so remarkable about it, painted by the Hogsmill stream, is its fidelity to nature, particularly the slanted willow against the brook, the numbers of plants, the dog roses, and its sheer intense detail. It is a painting which I'm assured is people spend more time in front of this painting in Tate Britain today than they do in front of any other painting, because its visionary quality is so entrancing. Notice the little robin that sings on a branch above Ophelia's head. There's also a shadow in the middle right underneath the dog roses, which is emblematic of a skull. There are a number of symbolic details within the painting. Every flower, of course, and many of them out of season, also allude to Ophelia's song as well. So Millet and Hunt were working close by each other. Hunt was working on Harling Shepherd, Millet working on Ophelia at the same time. And this really is the masterpiece of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. But Millet continued to paint lots of landscape backgrounds out of doors. Indeed, he did some informal studies. This one in Birmingham called Waiting, by just a dry stone wall, is a little bit looser. I mean, we couldn't really describe it as a loose painting, but it is not painted with the detail that Ophelia is painted, or in Isabella, one of his earlier paintings. It's 1854, and the woman there is just waiting. It was painted during a time, actually, when Millet too was probably waiting for an answer from Effie Ruskin. Also, the prescribed royalists, which is in the Andrew Lloyd Webber collection of royalist cavalier hiding in the Hayes Oak in Surrey, and there being taken some bread. And but the background is a wonderful piece of observation and landscape in the art of the 18th century. The trees and the foliage would be no more than a few brush strokes. Here with Millet, it plays a central part in this whole painting of dappled sunlight, and it adds to the intensity of the relationship too, the whole idea of nature being alive and nature in sympathy with human sentiment, a very important part of Pre-Raphaelite landscape. And Hunt too continued to paint another study near Fairlight, near Strayed Sheep, near Edward Lear's house, he paints this one. And if I'd like you to look at the painting on the right by Paul Hewitt, painted at the same time, and it gives you an idea of the difference of approach between English art and French art during this period. This is pre-impressionism with Paul Hewitt. But as you can see, Hunt is already very, very interested in optics and the ideas of using colour in a much more direct way. And in fact, he gives here this, you just would not normally have painted looking into a direct reflection or sunlight in quite that way. One can also see the influence of photography upon such paintings as this. Not that he painted from a photograph, but photographs gave us the idea about the tonality, particularly looking into the sun, which we didn't have before the advent of chemical photography. But this painting here, which is in the Ashmolean Museum, of the portrait of John Ruskin, this fated trip on which Ruskin's wife Effie falls in love with John Everett Millais, and eventually this leads to the breakup of the marriage, such as it is, painted by a stream up in Glenfinglas, about 10 miles outside of Callander, at Brig o' Turk. And I've stayed there and been to Brig o' Turk, and I've walked down the stream, and I've been to the rock where Ruskin stood. For Ruskin, it was Ruskin's father commissioned this painting. For Ruskin, it was very important that it include this particular strata of gneiss rock. Ruskin was a great collector of rocks, and each one, it was very important to him that he had the exact strata depicted. It was a very difficult place to paint, and there is a little cartoon by Millais with his brother, Awful Protection Against Midges, and I can certainly attest to that. In Scotland, these can be absolutely dreadful. So the conditions under which these paintings are painted is quite awful. This is a photograph actually of the site as it is today. So you can see it's almost exactly the same, apart from the fallen tree into the stream. And as you can see, Millais had been entirely faithful to the rocks in the background, and that's a very close detail to the painting. Quite extraordinary piece of painting, really. It is absolutely incredible that this is by sort of human hand, not just a photograph. But it's far more than that. It's a supreme study of the movement of water, and really the final sort of Pre-Raphaelite masterpiece of Millais, really, in that genre. But he painted a small one of Effie sewing by a waterfall further up Glenfinglas, lovely little painting which is in the Wilmington Art Institute in Delaware. Well worth seeing, and a lovely little study there. Again, rather like Wainting, painted slightly looser than of course the notable Ruskin portrait. And then Hunt too, he didn't always paint with such myopic detail. This is a painting from near his studio at Chelsea in the evening, 1853. This is good 15 years before Whistler was painting in Chelsea, and it has something of Chelsea, something of Whistler's approach in one sense. Only a small little panel, but there you can see it was a famous spot for painting, actually, the edge of the Thames, because it was so filthy and there was so much smog around. It fascinated artists. Indeed, G.F. Watts in 1850 painted this Found Drowned. Not in a Pre-Raphaelite style, but you can see this idea of painting water and reflection has always fascinated artists, and I'm sure it always will. And of course, the great James McNeill Whistler later on, I gave a talk on him 2 or 3 years ago now, painted so many pictures on the Reach at Chelsea. A friend of Holman Hunt, Thomas Seddon, who died tragically young after a trip to the Holy Land from dysentery. But this is a painting he did in France, which I think you'll agree, this one in Brittany is an incredible piece of Pre-Raphaelite landscape painting. And you can just see adopting all of those Ruskin principles of really examining nature in very, very close detail, and an entirely different type of landscape to what has gone before. 10 years before, this sort of landscape would never have occurred. So let's just go back to that one. But it was Holman Hunt who really took Pre-Raphaelite landscape onto another level, and particularly to another country. He went out to Palestine with his idea to paint authentic backgrounds to biblical scenes. He found it very, very difficult on arrival in Jerusalem to get any Jewish people to model for him, because such was their not need it, or they didn't like the idea of a representational painting, and or the representational, they would see it as idolatrous. So so in the end, he ends up painting this, painting the scapegoat, which but I want to show you this particular painting, painted on the Dead Sea, on the salt flats at the site of Sodom and Gomorrah, is in fact a remarkable piece of landscape painting. And there's a wonderful photograph of Holman Hunt sitting on the edge of the Dead Sea with his rifle cocked under his arm, because apparently it was a notorious place for robbery, and it was a dangerous place to paint. If it wasn't even, and the climate itself was particularly hostile, and yet Hunt comes up with this painting of the scapegoat, which of course is a type of Christ. The idea is that this goat was led into the wilderness to take away the sins of the people on the Day of Atonement, from the book of Leviticus. It also echoes, as with all of Hunt's paintings, he alludes to other paintings, and it is thought that Landseer's painting, Coming Events Cast Their Shadow Before Them, was an influence upon Hunt's scapegoat. This painting here is in Lady Lever Art Gallery in Port Sunlight. There is another version in Manchester City Art Gallery as well, with the inclusion of a rainbow. And this is by Thomas Seddon, who went with Hunt to the Holy Land. And this is looking down the Valley of Jehoshaphat. You can see on the dome there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I painted, or actually drew from this view only in October, so it's it's now a little bit more built up, but certainly you can still see this view. Another artist, a friend of Hunt, who often worked out in the Holy Land, was Edward Lear, and that's one of his paintings of Masada on the Dead Sea. Lear didn't adopt an entirely Pre-Raphaelite style, but he was very influenced by the idea of doing painting in very, very rich colours, and he was a good friend of Holman Hunt, and there's Holman Hunt's portrait of Edward Lear there in the top right-hand corner. Again, even Seddon's landscape, you might think, well, that's just it's just a painting, a landscape painting. There's nothing more to it than that. But the Valley of Jehoshaphat is thought to be the site of the Last Judgment. So both the sheep and the goats are there, and they are to be divided, and the shepherd lying underneath the tree is also symbolic as well of this fact that the judgment will take place in the Valley of Jehoshaphat on the Mount of Olives back there. And Hunt painted many great paintings in the Holy Land, and lots of them were in watercolor, and that's a very good example of the Dead Sea from Siloam. And then this one, he went down to Egypt as well. He painted in Egypt quite a bit, and it was interesting because lots of the places he painted were becoming very much a place sought after by the classical artists of Victorian England. 10 or so years later, I talked on Alma Tadema last year, and Tadema too, of course, went to Egypt. And so it was gradually becoming far more a place where artists were finding a rich source of subject matter. And being Victorian England, it was no good just making these things up. You had to go and to the original source and build up something that was really going to be very different and challenging as an art painting. This is perhaps my favourite painting by John Everett Millais, certainly in terms of landscape. The Blind Girl. Quite clearly, it is a remarkable piece of painting, and it was painted at Winchelsea on the south coast, near the Military Road. Turner had painted at Winchelsea too, and you can see the city gate in the background. But of course, it's all about the flood, Noah's flood, and then the covenant. And so you have the rainbow as a symbol, in a bow, a symbol of divine beneficence following the flood and the promise to mankind as well. So the ground is shining in the sunlight after the flood, after the rain, and you can see the creatures in the background happily grazing, and the crows flapping away. So it's an interesting one. Of course, it's all about senses as well. So the blind girl feels the harebell between her hand, and she can play music, but she can't see. And it's her companion who can see the promise. Millet was in a highly poetic period at this time. He had moved up to Scotland. He had got married to Effie. And in 1855, he paints this masterpiece, Autumn Leaves, which Ruskin, even though he and Millet no longer were on speaking terms, he was very quick to praise this particular painting, and he commented on it, the first instance of perfectly painted twilight, and it is indeed a masterpiece. And of course, it's about the cycle of life and the changes that will take place, and it's the knowledge in those young girls as they look at the bonfire that indeed that their lives will change, and that nature is cyclical. And of course, the young girl on the right is holding an apple, which is again indicates Eve in the Garden of Eden. So it's also kind of linked really with the idea of Giorgione and Venetian painting too, which often take place in this sort of ambiguity of twilight, and it has that sense. And Millet too, although it's highly detailed, there are passages in it which are more loosely painted due to the time of day, and it's beautifully observed. But Millet also influenced this artist, Arthur Hughes, and Arthur Hughes, again, another painting, Ashmolean Museum, Home from Sea. I mean, it's quite a trite subject, but the background, look at the background, it's painted at Chingford Churchyard, and it's a remarkable piece of painting of an overgrown aisle of a church in Victorian England, where so many were falling into dilapidation, waiting for Giles Gilbert Scott to renew them, no doubt. But there it is. It's all covered in ivy, and it is the young sailor boy returning home to find that his mother has died since he has been away at sea, and he's crying and weeping over his mother's grave. The dog roses in the painting, obviously, Hughes was enamored by Millet's dog roses in the back of Ophelia. Likewise, in this painting, the long engagement, which shows the name of the beloved carved onto the tree, Amy, but it's grown over with ivy. Ivy, the symbol of faithfulness, and all that is also echoed by the dog at their feet. But he is a young parson who can't afford to get married. It's a long engagement, and she patiently waits, and maybe there's some frustration in her face too, as he looks up to heaven, wondering when will be the time when they can fully get married. And this is a marvelous piece of Pre-Raphaelite painting, really. This is by Paul Maddox Brown, who was older than the other artists of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but although he paralleled their work, and he paints some very fine landscapes just for their own sake. And this is a view looking across from Hampstead, and it is a wonderful piece of painting, and it's just taken out of its frame here, so you can see all the trails of paint on the edge. And I rather like it because of its oval shape. It gives this idea, it's an eye looking out upon London, and at a very particular time of day. And Maddox Brown painted some really interesting landscapes. These are the small scale landscapes, probably no wider than a foot wide, but this is a good 10, 12 years before any of the Impressionists were working, or the Barbizon painters were working in this way. It's all out of doors, and these are lovely paintings. These really shows what it was like in Victorian England in the 1850s. We really get a good idea of rural labour and just what it was like to be in a nice cornfield in the evening in that period of time. And there we are, and that's as the harvest moon rises over the hay field. Another lovely piece of painting, and the workers at the end of the day taking their rest. And Maddox Brown does it so well. And they're beautifully painted works. And the rainbow too. Here is the rainbow from the Millet, but it's science also fascinated artists at this time, and the rainbow appears in a number of Pre-Raphaelite paintings, but also in Daniel Maclise's painting of Noah's sacrifice, which of course links all these in with this much greater story of the promise, God's promise to mankind, that as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold, heat, summer and winter, night and day will never cease. So for the Pre-Raphaelites and for the Victorians who looked at these paintings, they would see something more than just a painting with a rainbow, or even a scientific study of light. It was much more than that to them. And these are some great examples of rainbow paintings in the Pre-Raphaelite style. But Madox Brown also was engaged with social change, and this one painted in Hampstead High Street. Here's a photograph of the exact same spot. I took that a few years ago from where Madox Brown painted his famous painting Work. And again, it's the urban landscape, but of course he's very concerned about all the different social orders within this. It almost goes down the different orders of society in a sort of parade, right down to the street urchins in the front, from the Lord and Lady in the background. And Maurice and Carlyle look upon them and discuss philosophically about what it means for dignified work, or what is menial work, and all of these questions being addressed obviously in Victorian literature, but and philosophy, but also very much by artists. And for Madox Brown's great painting Work is this wonderful study, which is also true to nature. It's painted out of doors. It's election time in London at the back, and there's lots of election posters, and you really would have to go to the Manchester Art Gallery to have a look at it, and you can see lots of little details that you won't really get just from this photograph if you're watching on a small computer screen tonight. And Madox Brown still included landscape in his very late works, and this is in Manchester Town Hall, paintings which are about the history of Manchester. And this is Dalton collecting marsh fire gas. This is at the end of for Madox Brown's life. We can still see he's highly influenced by the Pre-Raphaelites, but he also he doesn't paint directly out of doors. This is a construct, unlike Millet's painting of pondweed or the that we have in Ophelia. Madox Brown has highly worked these things out, and you can see in some ways it's much more of a constructed painting, and even to some extent almost looks like a children's illustration, because there's ambiguity of scale between the figures in the bottom left-hand corner and Dalton collecting the gas in the middle. And it's also recording these paintings, Pre-Raphaelite paintings. This is highly praised painting by John Brett, who really took to Pre-Raphaelite landscape, particularly came under Ruskin's wing after Ruskin had seen this painting of the Stonebreaker from 1856. He really took charge of John Brett, as he saw him now as someone who could really carry out some of his ideals. And this is Box Hill in Surrey. And you can see the market as London. And stone breaking was, of course, the most difficult job, really, in Victorian England. I think there's some pretty horrible jobs in some of the factories and things, but stone breaking was thought to be one of the lowliest forms of occupation in Victorian England. And as we know, and there's Henry Wallace's painting of the Stonebreaker a year later, and this is the Stonebreaker who has died, and he's lying there at his work. And we think of other artists throughout Europe who were interested in this subject, particularly Gustave Courbet painted his famous painting of the Stonebreakers in 1849. And even Edwin Landseer paints in 1830 the Stonebreaker and his daughter. But again, it's not like the Pre-Raphaelite Stonebreaker, who we find nature painted in all its fullness. And it's the natural background in the Pre-Raphaelite works which make their paintings so distinct. So in a sense, it's this sort of autumnal afterglow in Wallace's painting, which suggests the passing of this poor Stonebreaker against the rock. And then Ruskin encouraged John Brett to go to Switzerland, and he painted this wonderful one on the left, and also this one of the hedger. Again, Ruskin was very concerned that the artists that he worked closely with, he commissioned them. He was very generous in some of his commissions, but he was also dictated exactly what he would like in the painting. And Brett was his man for a while. We have a look at this next one here. Yes, this one, the glacier. This one we shown. If you look at Thomas Fearnley's painting from about 20 years before, that's a more conventional painting of a glacier, very early Victorian England. But this one is a Pre-Raphaelite study. You can see a lot of the Millet painting of the Glenfinglas in that, but also something more, and this atmosphere in the background, which of course under Ruskin's direction, John Brett really works at, and again it's a remarkable piece of painting, very highly unusual, but a very powerful piece. Again, it's the gneiss rock as well, which Ruskin was so taken with. And indeed, it was the study of paleontology and geology which became a dominant factor in much of Victorian England, and the scientific analysis of rock and the age of the earth became a burning question for many Victorians. Another artist that John Ruskin championed a lot, and we're very fortunate in Oxford to have this painting, John William Inchbald's Early Spring from 1856, same date as the Stonebreaker painting. And as you can see, this is a wonderfully detailed, but a study of nature in spring, and the spring lambs in the background, and nature about to break forth into bud. And Inchbald also in his The White Doe of Rylstone, echoing the Wordsworth's poem. But Inchbald was an artist who was seen as really the inheritor of much that Millet had suggested in his landscapes, but of course Millet by now was much more concerned with figurative subjects rather than pure landscape subjects. He would not have, at this stage of his career, tackled a full landscape, but Inchbald was quite happy to take that on, and he paints some remarkable period, really up until the early 1860s. We have some very, very strong Pre-Raphaelite landscapes by John William Inchbald, an artist really worth of consideration. He was given an exhibition a few years ago, and it was interesting to see the development of his art, very much under Ruskin's direction. And John Brett also, under Ruskin's direction, painted, of course, Florence, which forms so much of Ruskin's treatise and his essays talking about the art of Florence. And this is a painting of Florence as well. It has an almost photographic look to it in some ways. This one's in the Tate Gallery. Another artist, from a Scottish artist who wasn't a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and indeed not close to them, but he was working in this highly detailed, what we can say Pre-Raphaelite style, is William Dyce. And this one, again, Pegwell Bay, the recollection of October the 5th, 1858. It actually features Halley's Comet, which is in the middle upper sky. You can just see a little smear of light in there. But it depicts women picking up fossils from a beach. And again, it is this question about geology, about the age of the earth, about why there would be stone fossils of fish or something like that on the shore, and questions arising as to the age of the earth were very active in the Victorian imagination at the time. Dyce was interesting in that he set, unlike Hunt, he didn't go to the Holy Land. He set his biblical scenes in Wales and in Scotland. There's a little bit of a background there in his one called Man of Sorrows, but it is a Pre-Raphaelite landscape in the background. And again, this comes to a head in the debate in the University Museum here in Oxford in the 30th of June 1860 between Thomas Henry Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford, and talking about the theory of evolution. And again, this preoccupies many artists in many different ways, considering whether the literal account of a six-day creation was plausible or was consistent with what they were finding in geology or in paleontology. And so this painting by Alexander Bowler in a fully Pre-Raphaelite style, Can These Dry Bones Live, alludes to the prophecy of Ezekiel and the dry bones which take upon flesh and are resurrected. And of course, this painting here is a painting which is seems to suggest, and there's a tiny little butterfly fluttering around in the background, that resurrection is indeed still, the hope there is still there, and as she ponders the grave in front of her. And this is Shelley's grave, as painted by William Bell-Scott, another artist who walked in sort of step with the Pre-Raphaelites while not being a Pre-Raphaelite himself. We have these lovely paintings of Keats and Shelley's graves here in Oxford. I know I was walking around the museum with Lorraine the other day, and we admired these paintings, and these are some examples of William Bell-Scott's paintings. Bell-Scott was quite a difficult man. He had an on-off sort of correspondence with Ruskin. He unlike Brett, he wouldn't go under Ruskin's influence. So Ruskin, you know, they have had words at times between them. Another artist who was working in a Pre-Raphaelite watercolor style was George Price Boyce, and he's particularly noted for some of his wonderful watercolor paintings along the River Thames, all the way to Mapledurham House particularly, and Binsey here near Oxford. But as the century wore on, the Pre-Raphaelite style became taken over by what we know as a second phase Pre-Raphaelites, which weren't working so much directly from observation, but from an internal world, a symbolic world, a world of beauty, a world of mystery, and a world of regret and nostalgia. And no greater artist illustrating that was Edward Burne-Jones. We can see something of the mood of Giorgione in this painting, The Mill, and something of Millet's Autumn Leaves in it, but it is now a very distinctly constructed landscape, an Italian landscape, but it is not the landscape of the early Pre-Raphaelites, and it's a landscape that is certainly much more artificial. And Inchbold himself loosened up as he became older, and he paints some quite lovely landscapes. This one of Stonehenge from the east, sort of echoing the Romantic artist John Constable's view of Stonehenge and the mystery of this great monument on Salisbury Plain. And again, it sort of marries Turner's skies with a Pre-Raphaelite intent. So this was a development in a very late Pre-Raphaelite work and Pre-Raphaelite landscape, which fed so much into this part of Victorian England. And there was a school in Liverpool. This is Williamson's landscapes, and they painted a lot of landscapes in North Wales in this type of style. And of course, many of you will know the landscapes of John Atkinson Grimshaw, painting in Headingley and in Leeds, and the unusual colours of the skies created by the smog from the industry in the valley. And they're very atmospheric paintings. They ostensibly are Pre-Raphaelite in one sense, they're highly detailed, but they are, again, rather like Burne-Jones's paintings, a construct, probably quite reliant upon photography as well. And great landscapes of the later Victorian era, an artist like George Viscount Cole as well, brings a landscape which is very different to those of the early Pre-Raphaelites. In fact, he would have no pretensions towards Pre-Raphaelitism. More, he nods his hat to someone like John Constable or some of the artists of the earlier part of the century, like Linnell. And with the great late Victorian landscape, which is in Birmingham City Art Gallery by Benjamin Leader, an artist from Worcestershire. A February Phildyke is seen as a great late Victorian painting. It's full of sentiment, and it could even be described as chocolate box, but it has a sort of truth to it, but it's the study of nature is very summary. It's not like the early Pre-Raphaelites. It doesn't have that close attention to detail, and one feels it is very much a studio creation, as beautiful as it may be. And both Millet and Hunt went their own ways. Millet abandoning his earlier Pre-Raphaelite style for larger, broader paintings, historical paintings, but he was noted in his later part of his life, and I've talked about this, he painted a series of really remarkable autumnal landscapes, and perhaps the best of them, Chill October from 1870, is where we're going to leave this talk today. And it led the way to something in the future which was going to be very important. This painting particularly impressed the very young Vincent van Gogh, who was working in London in the early 1870s for Goupil and Company. And he noticed this painting and he thought of it as a very great painting, and he continues to mention it throughout the rest of his life to his brother Theo. And we can see something in it in its zonal arrangement of recessing one layer of trees and the water and reflections in the water. We can see something of that in some of his paintings too. And Holman Hunt continued to paint in Palestine throughout his life, and spending great deals of time in Jerusalem painting. And this is a painting that he painted in 1877 above in the heights above Nazareth. And he painted a number of these paintings. He did sometimes call these pot boilers because his paintings took, his large studio paintings took so long to paint. He had to sell watercolors and smaller landscapes like this to sort of keep the wolf from the door during that time. So that's just yeah. Anyway, that's there we go. Just put that back there, and that's where we wrap it up. I have a few more art talks, which may be, if you're interested, I've got a number of Victorian art talks for Ardington coming up later this year, which may well interest you, and maybe some will come our way. And there's a picture of me and Lorraine having a nice time